So my name's Andrew, and the last time I was in Leeds was a few months ago, and I was running the National Cross Country Championships, and the sun was shining, and it was a beautiful day, and it was actually so hot I needed sun cream. So imagine my surprise when I got off the train this evening. Where'd it gone? Isn't it always like that in Leeds? It's very nice to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's so much glass and steel. Is this the future in a climate-safe world, I wonder? My name's Andrew, and I'm here because I've worked on climate change for quite a long time. I work with a few organisations, classic modern portfolio working. One group is called Scientists for Global Responsibility. Another is a think tank called the New Weather Institute. I've worked a lot on economic issues over the years. I was the policy director of a think tank called the New Economics Foundation for quite a long time. But the most specific and relevant reason for being here today is because with an international alliance of 50+ organisations, I'm helping to coordinate a project called the Rapid Transition Alliance. And their strapline is evidence-based hope in a warming world. Because probably in answer to the question which this session has been organised around about how do we get change, one of our profound beliefs is that in order to get change, you have to at first believe in its possibility. And there's so much, the scale of the problem seems so overwhelming at the moment that sometimes it's quite hard to do that. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about those kind of issues. And again, to put it into some sort of context, you had a bit of the climate-specific background. But of course, people often call this both a climate and an ecological emergency because we're putting pressure on all kinds of our life support systems. And to give some sort of sense of what that means, we came up a few years ago with a way of measuring the day in the year when, environmentally speaking, the world starts to live beyond its means, consuming more resources and producing more waste than the biosphere can safely regenerate and absorb. And this year, that day, globally, fell on July the 29th, which means we're now a good couple of months into the environmental red, if you like, living beyond our means. Now, if you were to do the same calculation for just the United Kingdom, we would have gone into the red even earlier, by about 2 or 3 months. That's the degree to which we're living beyond our means. Now, in terms of the change that we have to deliver, I know you've heard a little bit about this already, but some of the most recent number crunching done on this suggests that per person, we'll need to get our emissions down by the year 2030 to the equivalent globally of about 2.5 tons of CO2. Now, to put that into perspective, if you were to take a single return flight from London to Los Angeles, you would have pumped out about 2.6 tons of CO2e. In other words, you'd have blown your whole year's budget on a single flight. After that, you wouldn't be able to turn the kettle on or anything if it was fossil fuel powered energy. So in order to hit the kind of reduction rates which we're going to need to make those targets, another very recent piece of work has said that means pretty much absolute reductions of around about 95% of carbon emissions by 2030. And the International Panel of Scientists, the IPCC, tell us that this means rapid, far-reaching and unprecedented changes in all areas of society. And to me, and I've been working on these things for a long time, it kind of makes my head spin. And this has been said now so many times that if you look it up on the interweb, you'll see it attributed to at least half a dozen different people. This idea that it's almost easier to imagine the end of the world than it is a fundamental change to the economic system that we're living in. It's very hard to imagine the world being very different than the way it is. But every now and again, something happens which I think opens up a crack which enables us to get a glimpse of how things might be different. Now, this happened to me. I live down in South London. This happened to me a few years ago. I live under the flight path of aeroplanes going into Heathrow. And one morning, in spring in the year 2010, I woke up and something was different. I couldn't, to begin with, work out what it was. And I realised it was quieter than usual, and I put the radio on, and this news story came that somewhere far off, up further in the northern hemisphere, something had happened. A volcano had erupted in Iceland, a volcano with a very hard to pronounce name. So if there's any Icelandic speakers in the room, I apologise in advance, but it was something like Eyjafjallajökull. And because of the particular kind of particulate matter that went into the atmosphere, it meant it was something which was very toxic to modern jet engines. So overnight, the aviation industry was grounded, and it stayed grounded for several days. Something which modern society had come to take for granted was no longer available, one of the great arteries of the global economy. And you kind of think, well, we've become so dependent on it that would it mean almost quite literally that the sky was going to fall on our heads and everything would grind to a halt? And what happened next over the next few days, I found personally quite revelatory, because life just continued. People who were otherwise stranded turned to social media. They car shared, they sofa surfed. Other transport forms put on additional capacity. Supermarkets that had become used to flying in their sort of luxury salad goods from all around the world turned to local suppliers who gave more seasonal produce. Business people who'd been planning to go to meetings all around the world turned to video conferencing, and there was a sudden spike upwards. The Norwegian Prime Minister was stuck in at the United Nations headquarters in New York, and he ran his parliament from his iPad. So, almost turning on the flip of a coin, people adapted and found ways to avoid what has become one of the most carbon polluting forms of aviation. Now, of course, if that had just kind of continued and nobody had ever been able to fly again, it would have required a load more upheaval. But what it told me was that there's a lot more slack and resilience in our system to change and adapt how we live and what we do than sometimes we give ourselves credit for. And that's important, because after another big upheaval, the big financial crash that we're all still living in the shadow of in 2007, 2008, there was a bit of a rush to kind of get back to business as usual, so much so that the Wall Street Journal published a book several years after the crash called The Wall Street Journal Guide to Investing in the Apocalypse. And that worried me a lot, because it made me think that a lot of people just want things to continue as they are. But that same financial crisis also told us that other things which we'd been told previously could not be changed and were set in stone also changed. Economic policies changed overnight. The idea that we might effectively nationalise most of the high street banks overnight, if you suggested that 6 months before the financial crash happened, people would have laughed at you. In fact, Gordon Brown in 2006, just the year before, was boasting of his light touch regulation of the city. Other things happened during the financial crisis that gave us a glimpse of other potential ways of working. For example, in the United States, in the state of Utah, the municipality there that was under a Republican governor, because they were hard up for cash, decided to put their workforce on a 4-day week, and they had the presence of mind to monitor the impact of doing so. I personally think a 4-day week is one of those things which opens up all kinds of opportunities for change. Now, what they found there, because they bothered to study it, was also quite revelatory. They found that staff satisfaction went up, absentee rates went down. Customer satisfaction, the citizens using the services, a third of people said the services got better because they really thought about how to create access to those services. They also measured the carbon impact of that shift to a 4-day week. And in a 6-month period alone, they saw a 14% drop in carbon emissions. Strange things happen. Now, I mentioned aviation. Now, if you stop and think about how overwhelming the task facing us is at the moment, we can think back to sort of half-forgotten periods in our own history when we did incredibly bold, transformational things in very short periods of time. Today we see the railways as the environmental alternative to flying. Well, the railways themselves experienced their own rapid introduction. In a 7-year period in the middle of the 1900s, in the middle of the 19th century, we saw 4,400 miles of track, railway track, laid in Britain. In a single weekend in 1892, if you think about the difficulties we have these days, kind of upgrading, a bit of line, it goes on for years and billions over budget. In 1892, when we didn't have computer-aided technology for planning all these things, 177 miles of the Great Western Railway were laid in a single weekend. They started work at dawn on the Saturday morning and they opened the line at dawn on the Monday morning. I think that when we approach a problem with boldness and ambition, we can surprise ourselves with what is possible. Now, there's lots of other ways in which you can look at things which have been happening over the last few years where I think there's already a kind of cultural self-medication going on. For example, thinking about the green economy and repairing, reducing, reusing, recycling. The first repair cafe opened in Amsterdam in 2009. There's now about 1,700 of them. In terms of changing where money flows in the economy to get it out of fossil fuels, the first act of fossil fuel divestment happened in 2012, just 7 years ago. Last year saw the 1,000th.
Do you want to tell us what Repair Cafe is?
A repair cafe is where you might take... Yeah, rapid finish off, including answering that question. A repair cafe would be, things tend to have built-in obsolescence. It used to be the case that we would make things last. We would repair them, we'd maintain them, we'd keep them going. Now we've got into a very kind of disposable culture of stuff. But there's a big backlash against that now. So just to rapidly kind of finish off, just remembering how even just over the last few decades, there's areas in our lives when we have seen extraordinary changes. If you go back to the 1970s, about half the population smoked. Now only, less than 1 in 5 smoke. Driving on the roads has become immeasurably safer. If you think about how we turned around the HIV/AIDS crisis, and if you think about even more recently, in just the last 2 or 3 years, some of the behaviour changes which have been bubbling under for a while and that have suddenly accelerated, the sudden shift around single-use plastics, for example, overnight, something which people won't even kind of think about, suddenly became kind of unacceptable. And if you think about one of the lowest carbon ways of eating, the vegan diet, if you look at the most recent figures, exponential growth in the shift in diet. And who'd have thought that Greggs, who kind of introduced the vegan sausage roll as a bit of a joke, was so blown away by the response that they ran out of supplies for weeks after they announced it. It just goes to show how quickly things can change. And to kind of finish off, we've now got an enormous number of local authorities declaring climate emergencies and committing to radical carbon reductions. The will is there. We have to find the enthusiasm and the powers of innovation to make it happen. But again, how quickly things can happen. When the Swedish schoolgirl Greta Thunberg came to Britain earlier this year in January, the British Parliament hadn't debated climate change properly for about 3 years. She very publicly took the train rather than flying. 2 things happened after that, with a combination of other things like the school strikes going on. Within weeks, Parliament had voted to declare a climate emergency. And back in Sweden, where Greta came from, in just 4 months, the number of people taking flights in Sweden went down 8%. The number of people taking the train instead went up 8%. And that's just in 4 months. And if you talk to people in an industry and tell them that their customer base is going to change by that much, that quickly, it tells you that you have the seeds of transformational change. Have I got time to finish with a quote? I'm going to finish with a quote from one of my favourite writers, a North American author called Rebecca Solnit, and she's written a lot about this, and she's looked at how communities in dire circumstances can turn things around and make things happen. And she talks about the power of hope. She wrote a book called Hope in the Dark, and I just wanted to leave you with these words because they're what keeps me going. Rebecca writes this. She says, "Hope is not a lottery ticket that you can sit on the sofa and clutch feeling lucky. It's an axe you break down doors with in an emergency." She says hope should shove you out the door because it will take everything you have to steer the future away from endless war, from the annihilation of the earth's treasures and the grinding down of the poor and marginal. To hope, she writes, is to give yourself to the future, and that commitment to the future is what makes the present inhabitable. Thanks for listening.
So, the international perspective. So I think I've got a young children, and they're learning and they're dressing and everything. And whenever you do that, I think it's always good to locate your street your town, and then go bigger and bigger. So obviously we're in Leeds. We can all agree that we're living in Leeds, but Leeds is situated in West Yorkshire, and then you go bigger in Yorkshire, in the north of England, in England. England is in the UK. The UK is still, for now, in Europe. Europe is in the northern part of the globe, and the northern part of the globe is part of the full globe. So I think, obviously, when we're looking at solutions for our current situation, we can't just look where we are. We have to look at how we're connected to the whole picture, and especially in climate, as we know, it's global systems all interact. So I think there's a phrase about thinking globally but acting locally. So this presentation, this talk will hopefully reinforce some of those ideas and the necessity that it's kind of suicide or ecocide, if you will. That may get a red card, but the idea that thank you. The idea that it's many people will die if we're just thinking in by ourselves and just our small location. We have to look outside at the bigger picture. When we think of the Leeds and where we're situated in the world, we also need to think about the balances of power, the advantages that we have within this location. And I'm going to read a quote, which is from a writer called Carol Phillips, who grew up in Leeds. I think he's born in St Kitts and Nevis, but he's actually on the board of a few organisations that he's a patron, of a few organisations that are Leeds-based, Chapeltown Arts and Remember Olawale. And this is a book that speaks to a situation in Leeds. And so I'll just read this short quote from him. In 1858, the Empress of the British Empire, Queen Victoria, came to Leeds to open the newly constructed town hall. Boasting Corinthian columns and guarded by large stone lions, Leeds Town Hall was one of the largest civic buildings in Europe. The words around the vestibule, Europe, Asia, Africa, America, reminded the people of Leeds that only 1 year after the Indian Mutiny had been put down, the globe remained Britain's true sphere of influence. Leeds was perfectly positioned to take advantage of this fortuitous fact. Clothing was no longer the town's main business, and Leeds was becoming better known as the workshop of the world. Hundreds of factories produced bicycles, cranes, nails, sewing machines, bolts, train rails, locomotives, axles, bricks, and much more. There were scores of furnaces burning every day, and the sky was choked with chimneys and pollution. Glassworks and tanneries, skinworks and breweries, every type of industry was represented. Leeds was a hive of productivity and entirely dependent upon the labour of the poor and the young. So that gives some historical context to our present situation. And in hearing, we've got the dark satanic mills, which are described in Manchester and Leeds as well. So I think we need to look at the climate debt, I suppose, and the our contribution living in this country, living in this city, to solving the problem. And when we think of debt and aid, that's often something that is given, or something that is perceived to be something that we as a developed country give to so-called developing nations. And one of our colleagues talks about how that maybe needs to be turned on its head, in that because of the historical nature of how this civilization, these big lofty buildings and electricity and power have been built, we need to look at who we actually owe in terms of paying for solving the climate crisis. And there's real power in the language that we use there, because the idea that these nations who have been exploited historically, who've had their peoples taken and enslaved, who've had their land fenced off, who've had their traditional ways of living taken away from them in harmony with the land and forced to grow one type of crop or forced to work in factories. This also happened in England, of course, as well. That they are seen as developing, and we have to ask, what are they developing towards? Is the way we live now the peak? Is this developed in itself? So other terms we may look at would be exploited, exploiting countries, maldeveloped. But key within all this is that the fact that the world as it is and the education system we have does still put this way of life that we are for England and Europe and the Americas as the standard. And I think if we are to look at other countries developing as we have, then we pretty would soon face extinction. And there's lots of deaths that occur with this way of being. So throughout this process, there's been a lot of death of knowledge, particularly death of language, death of obviously land and fauna and peoples and history. And I know, Penina, you've just returned from Brazil, and you're very close to your family in Kenya, and we talk often about, do you want to talk a little bit about the knowledge systems that are there and that are perhaps not as evident?
Yeah, I think, they just come back from Brazil, and which was a real honor and pleasure, because a lot of the people in the room and the women, it was an event around movement building, and the people in the room, some of them are from the Amazon, and what they were talking, I don't know whether we spoke this morning, and I said some of the questions that they were asking is, what do you call these scientists? How can you, some of the presentations that they were making, do you call these science anthropologists when they're damaging the land, when they're, and I think along all of what you're sharing is capitalism has been the driver in terms of damaging the planet and continuing. So when we're asking what are they developing to, is because we still have this way of thinking or associating development as kind of technology, material things, but the material things are actually damaging something else on the other hand. So I grew up in Kenya, and I've often given examples of, like, I lived in a city, but my grandma lived in the rurals. And they had no electricity, no running water, and everything was from the land. And we're saying how sometimes if you, for example, in terms of wastage, and again, a comparison between what we see as the civilized West versus that way of living, is how much wastage we have around food. And in terms of what we need to be thinking about is that as well, because she has to plant the seed, and then whatever comes out of that, she harvests it. Whatever comes out of that, she peels it. The peels go to the animals, and then whatever wastage comes from the animals, uses it to plaster the house. Whatever is cooked is eaten. Whatever is left over is eaten the following morning. So in terms of wastage, there's very little that you put in the bin, because even if it's to put out whatever scraps that are left on the pot, it'd be to the chicken, and then the chicken are somehow. So in terms of recycling, that way of living has continued, but then come to our way of living in a city is completely different, because we have electricity, and the same with the water. Whatever water we use for, because they had to kind of get it from the rain, you don't waste anything. Whatever you use for cooking, you use it for washing the pot, you use it for watering something else. And that's a way that is considered uncivilized or backward. If we look at technology, if we look at how civilization or Western society has continued to live. So in terms of losing indigenous knowledges and ways of living that's connected to nature or one with nature, those ways of living compared to, say, again, if I say to what the Amazonian women were talking about is the forest is everything. And one statement that I took away from the talks was, if it wasn't for them, the Amazon wouldn't be here. And it wouldn't be standing as it does right now, but they were weeping as they're saying, look at what's going on there, because the Amazon gives us life, it gives us food, and we protect it, including protecting with our bodies. But if we, again, switch back to when we're talking climate, and which is why we wanted to talk about internationalism, there is no just Leeds climate, there is no just, England climate, it's international. What's happening there is impacting here, but it's also how the connections of what was taken from in terms of exploitation and resources that mean people have to run for their lives. And I know people kind of get het up when we say climate crisis is racist crisis, but it's because it's the people who are poor, it's the resources, the people who have no resources to deal with the climate damage that there is right now, which is what you're saying about the debt, that mean that they've had to run. So if you look at climate, you understand migration, you understand poverty, you understand class, you understand all of those things that have been taken from, and in terms of responding to and asking for people to take responsibility is bearing in mind all of those factors. How often do we change clothes? How often do we buy clothes for £2? Do we think about why we're paying £2? Where has it been made from? How much water has been spent? And if it's in countries where water is such a short resource, or like it's a bit of they don't have a lot of water, and they're using the little bit of water for us to come and get dressed and check clothes every 2 months. What are we doing? So there is responsibilities that we could take individually, but also if we're looking on a broader climate change, we need to think bigger than just the very short-term stuff. But yeah, that's the Kenyan perspective.
Brilliant. Yeah, and that's exactly it. It's about making those connections that is really important for us to do and to keep doing. And as Penina says, there's a hierarchy of science and people who are in the academy, in universities, and with big jobs and lofty titles. But there's also what Penina's talking about is the folk science, the knowledge of communities who've lived off the land and with the land and in harmony with the land for generations, and that's been squashed and it's been put down and people have been dispersed, and these people are the caretakers. As Penina says, they look after the Amazon. A lot of people don't know that there were more fires taking place in the Congo Basin than the Amazon. That narrative was totally shifted off the news agenda. But there's so much knowledge and spirit that people have. One key quote I remember hearing when I was at some climate talks for one of the COP meetings, the COP is Red Card, the Conference of Parties climate talks, one of these big things with people. But this was an alternative to that, and one of the Native American indigenous women there, one of the elders was talking about how for them human rights is an alien concept, that they really don't see they can't understand human rights, because for them humans are not divorced from land, from spirit, from animals, and that they don't have a hierarchy of humans above everything, that they are a part of nature. We've got 3 minutes left. So I think, the main things to emphasize are, as Penina says, that there's making those links, and there's so many people who are fighting out there, who are doing this, who we can take a lead from. And as we've said, the traditional relationship that we've seen of giving these countries and these peoples charity, that needs to be turned on its head, because, as we said, that there's some real debt that we owe them, not that they don't owe us. We've stolen a lot of their land and their resources, but also, they can teach us a lot. So instead of going to these countries and saying, oh yeah, we've got all this technology, we've got this know-how, we've got this science, we actually need to be humble and say, what can you teach us? Because we did in this country used to be connected to the land. There was the witch hunts that took a lot of the traditional knowledge in Europe from women who were traditional healers and used herbs and everything. So we've lost that through this now system of capitalist domination. There's so many connections from the technology, from the phones that connects to the Congo. The air we breathe, we breathe in the Nigeria Delta. A lot of the oil is taken from Nigeria. Obviously, the clothes from Bangladesh and elsewhere, Colombia, all over the world. We can't move without impacting by transport, by food, by clothing. So it's about making those connections and really acting in solidarity with those communities. If we've got any time left, I could end with a short poem, actually, because a lot of the work we do is again, dealing with these big concepts, but also a way to communicate this is through different ways. So again, coming out of academia, but getting into more art forms and more performative ways of talking with youth and with other people, and art is a really good way of conveying some of these messages. So I'll just read one verse of this. It's called Reparations Song, and it's based on the song by Bob Marley, Redemption Song. Wilberforce was the slave savior. All Africans are dum-de-dum-dum. Old private multinational corporations, yes, they still rob I. Sold I Wilbur Wash and heroes like William Pitt. Centuries after they supposedly freed I, We're still dealing with destruction of culture, identity, institutions, societies, religions, philosophy, land, people's history, herstory, and black inferiority, white supremacist bullshit. But my Haitian brothers and sisters, together with European solidarity movements and Maroon uprisings and African resistance, were strong. By repelling the armies of Spain, Napoleon, and Blighty, they died for this generation, rebelling triumphantly. So, won't you help to bring some movement towards much needed holistic self-repair, societal change, global healing, and eventual freedom? Because we all need to have reparations dialogue. Do not congratulate yourselves for abolition of slavery. When capitalism still capture we body and mind, pay no tax for atomic weapons or energy, because all of them just a climate crime. For long must we kill their profits till they stand aside and look. The human race, yes, we're all a part of it. They've got to give back what they took. So, won't you help to bring these first steps in the process of global justice, truth, reconciliation, and understanding the true complexities and legacies of Ma'angamizi, red card, the African Holocaust of chattel colonial and neo-colonial enslavement, and true freedom? Because we all need to have reparations dialogue. You can sing that with me? Reparations dialogue. And again, reparations dialogue. Thank you.